Well, hello and greetings, International Studies 200 students. Dr. Foster back week 5 of our course, Interdisciplinary Approaches to Globalization. And this week what I wanted to do is, for this session anyway, is to give us a crash course or brief primer on economic globalization. And so we've covered approaches to globalization, we've covered histories of globalization, we looked at diversity last week. And today we're going to jump into what is arguably one of the most important driving forces of globalization itself, and that is the economic aspects of it. So trade, production, consumption, international finance, all of these things make up economics, and what we are going to call this module economic globalization. So I want to start by making sure that you understand when we say economic globalization, it's not just economics in general. So the kind of economics that have driven economic globalization for the past 50 years is a particular kind of economics. And so what I wanted to focus on today is giving you a sense of exactly what that is. And it's what scholars or experts call neoliberal economics, neoliberalism, or neoliberal globalization. And so I want to focus on that word for a minute and give you an idea of what that is and what it isn't. So neoliberal does not have anything to do with contemporary United States-based politics, where you have a group of conservatives and liberals, right? The liberal in neoliberal economics or neoliberal globalization does not have anything to do with our contemporary political system here in the United States. So I want you to just start off by realizing that that's what the term, we'll talk about what the term liberal and neoliberalism means, but it doesn't have anything to do with politics, liberal, conservative. So let's just get that clear to begin with. It has more to do with economics than anything. The neo part of it means new. The liberal part of it means classic liberalism of the 17th and 18th century, which really focused on trade and market economies and the freedom of markets. So when we talk about globalization, we have to speak of economics, and we are speaking of a particular kind of economics. It's not driven by communist economics, it's not driven by socialist economics or any other kind of economics. It's driven by capitalist economics and a specific kind of capitalism, neoliberal capitalism. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, first we've got to go back and historicize it, and we're going to begin in the post-World War II context in the 40s and 50s. And I just want to say that we've been talking about the histories of globalization, and we've gone back, you've read about scholars having gone back to the period of imperialism and before. But what folks really mean, scholars, experts, students, activists, when we talk about globalization is a kind of contemporary globalization or modern globalization that we really want to say didn't get started until after World War II and really came into its own in a global context in the 1970s all the way up through today. So we're talking about a mid to late 20th century phenomenon and 21st century phenomenon. There's a specific kind of globality that is represented in what people now call globalization. So we can certainly talk about histories, we can certainly talk about imperialism as an early globalizing force, but globalization, as we're going to speak of it and how it's spoken of and characterized now, is a phenomenon from the essentially mid to late 20th century and 21st century. So we have to go back to Bretton Woods, which happened in the post-World War II context, and just to give you a sense of how important that is, if you go back to 26, as you read in our last chapter on history in the textbook, 26 of textbook, the authors say that The Bretton Woods system created the basic architecture for globalization. And then on page 51, they say that the specifically neoliberal policies of Bretton Woods dominate economic globalization. So Bretton Woods was a conference between leaders and economists from 44 nations after World War II. And they really, at that point, wanted to talk about how to integrate the global economy and how to help it recover after a very devastating and global war. So as you know, World War II wasn't just in Europe. It spanned from East Asia to Africa to Europe to United States and beyond. So it was really a global war, hence the world part of it. And Bretton Woods, in addition to moves that we'll talk about in later chapters, like the creation of the United Nations, which really wanted to try to figure out how we could get together internationally and not have another world war, right? Bretton Woods actually wanted to see how we could have a global economy that would essentially make trade global and also, in a sense, prevent some of the causes that created that world war, as you read about in this chapter. So the Bretton Woods organization is that conference. And what really came out of it was the architecture of globalization, the architecture of economic globalization. And that included institutions like the World Bank, which you read about in this chapter, the IMF, or the International Monetary Fund, and the General Agreement on Trades and Tariffs, which actually turned into World Trade Organization. So you probably know of that now as the WTO. And so this is again the basic architecture of globalization. It's economic globalization, but it's specifically neoliberal capitalism or neoliberal globalization or neoliberalism. And remember, that doesn't have to do with contemporary politics in the United States, liberal versus conservative. That's not at all what it is. It's more about economics. It's more about markets. So let's pause and try to define that. So what I want you to do is turn your textbooks to page 47, and you get a good, not only a definition of neoliberalism and what it entails, but you also get a number of perspectives. So this is the subsection in this chapter on economic globalization called perspectives. It's from 47 to 51, and it gives you a sense of what neoliberal globalization set out to do and some of the effects and criticisms of it. All right, so here's what Jan Schultz, this is how he defines neoliberalism, or another way of calling it again is neoliberal capitalism, neoliberal globalization. So here's what it is, and this is in the block quote on 47. I'm going to quote at length. Neoliberalism focuses not just on economics, but also on economics of a particular kind, namely laissez-faire market economics, or hands-off market economics. In a word, from a neoliberal perspective, the global economy should be a free and open market. Production, exchange, and consumption of resources should unfold through forces of supply and demand as they emerge from the uninhibited interactions of a multitude of firms and households in the private sector. Multilateral institutions, national governments, and local authorities exist to provide regulatory frameworks that maximize the efficiency of global markets, for example, by securing property rights and enforcing legal contracts. All right, so I'm going to continue on. Schultz suggests that this dominant policy, enforced through the actions of the World Bank, the IMF, and the WTO, that is, the architects of contemporary economic globalization, the architects of globalization itself, has not truly helped arbitrate global inequality. He argues that in the areas of human security, social justice, and democracy, neoliberal economic policies have been ineffective and, in fact, have increased destitution. He looks at markers of poverty in the Soviet bloc between 89 and 96 and describes an increase from 14 million to 147 million people living in poverty. He sees increases in global unemployment as contributing to declining human security, and also argues that when the market meets the environment loses. And he says, finally, neoliberalism affirms implicitly, if not explicitly, that conflicts between market efficiency and ecological integrity should be settled in the favor of the former. So in other words, what he means there is that when concerns about the market or profit or monetization come up against environmental concerns, the environment loses out. And so this is just one example of the guiding principle of neoliberal capitalist economics, is that essentially markets, profit, monetization are paramount and should be valued over and against people, the environment, places, animals, and everything else. So the efficiency of the market, a global market, an unimpeded market, a deregulated market, a privatized market, is the number one priority in a sense. And so there's a number of proponents and criticisms of this idea, but critics would say that essentially, to pare it down, neoliberal economics places profit over people, profit over places, profit over animals, and there is a substantial amount of evidence to back that up. There's also evidence that these policies and the integration of the global market have brought gains throughout the world. So what I want you to do is think about that definition of neoliberalism, look at this perspective section where you get examples of scholars weighing in on these debates, and you even have proponents of neoliberal economics who have decided that it actually increases inequality and hasn't created the sort of benefits that it set out to do. On the next page, you have Joseph Stiglitz, who was a senior economist at the World Bank, even, so a proponent, and George Soros, entrepreneur, both criticize neoliberal economics, neoliberal globalization in various ways. So I want you to read that and think about that. But when we talk about the architecture of globalization and those three institutions that really dominate, and remember that economic globalization isn't just economics in general, it's specifically neoliberal policies, neoliberal architecture that dominate economic globalization. So the kind of globalization we're talking about since the 1970s to now is dominated by neoliberalism, which again, remember, not doesn't have to do with politics in the United States. So just keep that in mind again. So what happens? What happened with these institutions of neoliberal economic globalization? So there's a couple of key processes and practices that we have to go back and look at. And so I want us to go back to page 38 and 39 when they really go over the Bretton Woods, and I want you to familiarize yourself with that conference and those institutions in this chapter. But these institutions, again, were created to try to initially emphasize global integration, global economic integration, through loans to nations who were devastated by World War II, but then it moved on to giving loans to nations throughout the global South. And one thing that I want to mention that is a similarity between these nations who are debtors to these institutions are that, on the one hand, nations were devastated by World War II, and so they were in a place where they needed economic help to get back on their feet, so to speak. And then later, loans to the global South, nations in the global South, so we're talking about Africa, Caribbean, India, places like that, were similarly devastated to greater or lesser effect by the imperial and colonial processes that we were talking about a couple of weeks ago. European empires and whatnot, in the sense that European empires, for profit motive, expropriated value from those places towards the mother country. So what that did was leave nations weak or even in tatters. And so to exist on a global stage, they needed to take out loans from these really, really large world-level institutions that do that. So that's the World Bank, IMF, International Monetary Fund, and the GATT, which turned into the World Trade Organization. So these institutions gave out a kind of larger national level loans at a lower interest rate than commercial for-profit banks, but what came with them were what's called conditionalities, which means conditions that these nations had to follow in order to get these loans. And these essentially effectively meant a major restructuring of not just the nation's economies, but the fabric of its societies. And these restructurings were imposed from outside, right? So you also have criticisms leveled at these processes as being neo-imperial or neo-colonial, sort of indirect colonization from outside. And there are typically three dimensions, and this is on page 39, of these conditionalities that these architects of globalization wield. And I want you to really pay close attention to these, and I want you to go back and look at exactly what we mean by these. But they are privatization, deregulation, and austerity. So to privatize something, as you'll see here, they give a couple of examples. One's El Salvador, and one is Bangladesh, and they give an example of how privatization had negative effects on these places, and you can find many more. And deregulation, they give you a couple of other examples, Zambia and Haiti, and austerity, Greece and Portugal. And I want you to look carefully at all these examples, but I'm going to go through what these mean now, and we'll discuss later whether online or live in person. Privatization means to put something that was formerly a public good or run by a nation or a state in private hands. Privatization. Private hands means that now it is in control of a private corporation or a private business. And remember that the difference between those two things is that a private corporation or a private business are motivated by profit, right? So privatizing water, for example, or something else that is a public good that has to do with the environment. So this means that there is now a sort of profit motive there, which, as they say in the example of El Salvador, resulted in, so there's the privatization of electricity is another example. In El Salvador, the privatization of electricity resulted in increased rates, so it's higher costs for people, reduced access for low-income people, so not as many people could have that or afford it, and a notable decline in quality. So quality goes down when you privatize something because there's a profit motive there. And there's a couple of more examples that they give, but that's what to privatize something means, when it goes from a public good or something that's state-run to a private company or a private business or a private corporation. And again, one of the rationalities behind neoliberal economics is to profitize it or to monetize it, right? Something that hadn't been a market before now becomes a market, and so we can now make money off of water or electricity. And by we, I mean private corporations. So that's privatization, and that's one of the conditionalities that IMF, WTO, World Bank, as architects of globalization, impose around the world, not just in Europe, but in the globalist South as well. So this idea of privatization. Deregulation is the second. And so that's an easy one, right? To deregulate something means just to get rid of regulations, to get rid of rules, to get rid of limitations. And so the stated goal of neoliberal economics is to make the global market free and open, and to kind of tear down trade barriers and things like that, because the market should dominate. The efficiency of the market should be priority one, right? And so to deregulate means to kind of break down all of these regulations, barriers, and limitations to trade, essentially, to trade and economic opportunities. So this can have to do with reducing taxes or tariffs on imports or exports or things like that, but it also has to do with other sorts of regulations, like, for example, in the United States, we have worker safety laws. And so one argument of sort of the global instantiation of deregulation is that these laws inhibit a corporation's ability to come in and profit as much as they would want to. So regulation doesn't just mean sort of taxes and imports, but it can mean anything that is a barrier to profit, right? Anything that's a barrier to profit. So the third sort of practice or mechanism of the Bretton Woods, later called Washington Consensus, which we can just call neoliberalism, is to deregulate. So privatize, deregulate, and then the third, I should just do the one hand instead of the two, it's not six. Third is austerity measures. To be austere is to cut back on things. And so in particular, and this is again on page 39, what austerity measures do from afar is to say, okay, in order to pay back your loans or you're in a crisis, you have to cut back on social spending and reinvest that into markets and the economics. And so why is that a problem? Because social services are important to the health of a society or a group because they include things like healthcare. Healthcare is a social service. Education is a social service, things like that. So these are all social goods, but one sort of condition or conditionality in this sense of neoliberalism is that you have to cut out that social spending. If you're a government and you owe us money, you've got to cut out social spending and focus more on money and economics so that you can pay us back. So that's good for the lenders, but it's not good for the people in a particular nation. And you can find examples of this in Jamaica in this chapter and in Greece. And I think they also give you the example of, at the end of the chapter, Iceland as well. And that's in the context of the 2008 financial crisis, which was brought about by neoliberal economic policies. And we're actually going to look at Jamaica more specifically. Unfortunately, in this chapter, they don't really get into how that affected Jamaica and actual Jamaicans. But next week, we're going to watch a great film called Life and Debt about neoliberal globalization in Jamaica. And so it's going to give us more of a picture of what these policies and practices really mean. So I want you to make sure that you're understanding the Bretton Woods institutions, WTO, IMF, and the World Bank. And I want you to make sure that you're understanding those three important kind of mechanisms of globalization, deregulation, privatization, and austerity. And then the last thing I wanted to mention is the inauguration of what's called the transnational corporation as a global force under the specific kind of globalization that we're talking about. And now when I say globalization, we're going to mean neoliberal globalization, which has its origins in the post-World War II context, and as we've said, is essentially at its height from the 1970s to now. So globalization specifically is during that short time period that we're living with now. Another kind of global force, they say on page 55, is the transnational corporation. And I want you to check out this sort of wild figure that they have on page 50. In 2002, 50 of the top 100 global economies were companies, not nations. Okay, so you would kind of think that all of the top economies would be entire nations themselves. In 2002, 50 of the top 100 global economies were companies or corporations, transnational corporations. So these corporations, they say, have mobility of capital and power. That's very powerful. Transnational corporations work this mobility to their advantage. One aspect of the declining power of the nation state under globalization is that transnational corporations are generally private. So again, privatization, private. And they are neither responsible to a particular state nor subject to international organizations such as the United Nations. So there's something like a limited liability there. Their international non-status immunizes them from direct accountability to international legal norms and permits them to use sympathetic national governments or coerced national governments that have no other choice really, to parry outside efforts to mold their behavior. One example of this is the rise of what's called sweatshops. So giant industries that really have incredibly exploitative practices towards their workers. In the United States, that's formally outlawed or frowned upon, but since transnational corporations have this mobility and power, they can look to developing nations to exploit essentially in that sense and set up sweatshops and things like that. And so through a lot of sort of legal loopholes, they are immune to accountability for those sorts of practices. And so on the outset, the sort of line of neoliberal capitalism is that is a good product of an open and free market, open and free global market. So to detractors or critics, they say that at best it's exploitative, and at worst it's a violation of human rights around the world for the sake of profit, right? So neoliberal economics, profit over whatever you want, people, environment. It's the prioritization of this particular idea of a free market, but free in the sense of deregulated, privatized, and some of the other things that we're talking about. So what I want you to do is really study this chapter, get a sense of the Bretton Woods and its institutions as architecture for economic globalization. I want you to understand that global economic globalization, right, or global economics, is a particular kind of economics that we've had, and that's neoliberal since the post-World War context to now. And then I want you to really understand and study the three main mechanisms by which that globalization was instituted: privatization, deregulation, and austerity. And I want you to make sure that you're understanding those terms. And then I want you to bring questions and comments to the online discussion board we'll be having this week, and then the live online discussion Q&A session, which is required for section 002 and optional for 801. So I want you to try to really sort of reflect on all of the contexts here, the histories and the ideas and the concepts, specifically neoliberalism, and then come with questions and comments on those things so we can clarify some of these things as we go. This will be our first week on economic globalization. We'll have another one next week. Again, we'll be looking at life and debt, so some real life examples of these policies around the world and how we got there. So that's it for today. That is economic globalization, specifically neoliberal economic globalization, neoliberalism, neoliberal capitalism, whatever you have it. And I will see you later in the week. I look forward to it, and be well, everyone.